In the early 1900s, gasoline engines spread fast. Cars moved from novelty to necessity, and companies rushed to sell more power and higher speeds. But inside the cylinders, a new problem grew louder. Engines knocked. The fuel-air mix exploded at the wrong moment, sending sharp shocks through metal parts. It wasted power, cracked components, and shortened engine life. If knock stayed unsolved, the promise of the car risked stalling. Knock was not just an annoyance. It set a hard limit on how engines could improve. Higher compression gave more strength from the same fuel, but it also made knock more likely. Drivers blamed manufacturers. Manufacturers blamed fuel, and fuel suppliers blamed engine design. Everyone wanted the same thing, a simple way to make gasoline burn smoothly on demand. The industry needed an additive that worked in tiny amounts and cost almost nothing. That need triggered a race. Inventors tested chemicals by the hundreds, chasing anything that calmed the violent early explosions. Oil companies saw a threat and an opportunity at the same time. If cars failed, fuel sales suffered. But if one company controlled the fix, it controlled the future. The solution had to be practical for mass production, stable in storage, and easy to mix into gasoline everywhere. The clock kept ticking. The key breakthrough came from a simple test with huge results. A tiny amount of tetraethyl lead mixed into gasoline made the violent knocking almost disappear. Engines ran smoother, and they could be pushed harder without tearing themselves apart. For an industry desperate for an answer, it sounded like a miracle. The additive looked cheap, powerful, and easy to blend. It turned a looming technical crisis into a product opportunity overnight. That success created its own pressure. If this formula worked, someone else could claim it first, and the winner controlled a new market. So the focus shifted fast from cautious testing to rapid rollout. There was an obvious problem, though. Lead was not an unknown substance. It already carried a long record of poisoning, especially for workers who handled it. But the promise of a fix for knock felt immediate, while the risk felt distant and manageable. The decision followed the money and the momentum. Instead of treating lead as a warning sign, it became a challenge to be managed through procedures and messaging. The additive was framed as safe in the amounts used, as if dilution erased danger. Plans were made to scale production and lock in partnerships before doubts could slow it down. The logic was blunt. Solve knock now, dominate the market, and deal with questions later. The commercial race outweighed the toxic history. The first batches of tetraethyl lead did not stay on paper for long. They moved into real refineries and real labs, handled by workers who had no reason to expect a poison that acted fast. Then the warning signs appeared. Men became dizzy and weak. Some shook uncontrollably. Others could not sleep or suddenly could not think straight. It looked like a normal workplace problem, until it kept happening. As production continued, the symptoms turned stranger and harder to deny. Workers reported confusion and terrifying hallucinations. They panicked, lashed out, and seemed to lose touch with reality. Some collapsed. A number died. These were not isolated falls or burns or machine injuries. This was chemistry entering the body and attacking the nervous system. The pattern followed the work, and it followed the additive. The companies involved responded with speed, but not with openness. They tightened control over information and treated the poisoned workers as a public relations problem. They avoided using the word that triggered fear and pushed a new name that sounded clean and modern. The sicknesses became individual cases, not a warning about the product. The message stayed simple. These were rare events, already handled. With the additive moving from the lab toward mass production, the next problem was trust. The companies needed drivers to accept it, and quickly, so they sold a new idea, not a chemical. The gasoline became ethyl, a clean, modern name that avoided the word everyone feared. Lead stayed off the pump and out of the headline. The product entered the market as progress, not poison. Stations began offering ethyl-blended fuel as a premium choice, tied to smoother engines and better performance. Advertising focused on power and efficiency, and it worked because it answered a real annoyance people felt every day. Meanwhile, the earlier worker poisonings got treated like a separate story, not a warning about what went into the tank. The message stayed simple. This was a controlled, safe improvement handled by experts. That confidence did not spread by accident. Industry groups and company-funded voices helped set the tone of public discussion, steering attention toward benefits and away from risk. When questions surfaced, they met a familiar pattern: reassurance, selective facts, and the idea that only careless handling caused harm. The public learned to think of danger as something inside factories, not something that came out of tailpipes. A belief took hold before the evidence did. Not everyone accepted the new additive as progress. Public health specialists and chemists warned that this was not an ordinary chemical that disappeared after use. Lead persisted, it settled, it accumulated. If it went into gasoline, it went out the tailpipe, and then into the air people breathed and the dust that coated streets, windowsills, and soil. A private factory hazard started looking like a city-wide experiment. These warnings created an obvious question for regulators. How much lead would millions of cars scatter, and what happened after years of breathing it? The industry answered first. Company-funded research emphasized uncertainty, small samples, and short timelines, and it treated everyday exposure as too low to matter. Meanwhile, public statements framed critics as alarmist and unscientific. The debate shifted from harm to proof, and proof took time. As the arguments piled up, the practical effect became delay. Agencies hesitated without a clear consensus, and that hesitation suited the companies selling the additive. Advertising and friendly experts reassured drivers that the product meant cleaner, smoother engines, not poison. Independent researchers kept pushing, but their findings competed with louder messaging and better funded studies. The early pushback existed, yet it struggled to translate into rules before the fuel spread everywhere. By the middle of the century, the argument was no longer about one additive. It was about momentum. Car ownership expanded fast, highways spread, and fuel demand climbed year after year. Refiners scaled up to match it, and leaded gasoline fit neatly into that machine. It solved the performance problem in a cheap, reliable way. Once it worked in one country, it spread to others. Leaded fuel became the default. This growth changed what lead pollution meant. Earlier, the worst exposures clustered around the places that made the additive and blended the fuel. Now the source multiplied by the millions. Every tank filled, every mile driven, every engine firing carried the same basic chemistry. Lead did not burn away into nothing. It left the tailpipe attached to tiny particles, then drifted down onto streets, buildings, and soil. The everyday commute became a release mechanism, and that meant contamination stopped being a rare accident and started being routine. In city after city, traffic became a moving industrial process, spread across every neighborhood. The highest levels gathered where cars gathered, busy roads, intersections, downtown corridors. But it did not stay neatly contained there. Dust moved, rain washed it, and people tracked it indoors. Lead was no longer just a factory problem. It was the air of modern life produced by ordinary driving. Once leaded gasoline filled streets everywhere, the question stopped being whether lead escaped the engine. It did. The question became how much and what it did to people who never worked in a refinery. Public health teams started measuring lead in city air and in dust that settled on sidewalks, windowsills, and playgrounds. Then they looked for the same metal inside the human body. Blood tests turned a suspicion into a number. The pattern hardened as the sampling widened. Neighborhoods with heavier traffic showed higher lead in air, higher lead in dust, and higher lead in residents. Children stood out immediately because their bodies absorbed more, and their hands and mouths met the dust constantly. Clinics and researchers began finding blood lead levels that did not match any obvious workplace exposure. The source looked ordinary. It looked like daily driving. As more cities ran surveys, the story stopped sounding like rare poisoning and started sounding like background contamination. Lead did not spike and vanish. It stayed because cars emitted it day after day, and the particles stayed in the places people lived. Researchers connected higher blood lead levels to measurable changes in development and behavior, most clearly in kids. The harm no longer needed a headline accident. It happened quietly at scale. By the time the evidence piled up, the argument changed. It stopped being about whether lead was dangerous and became about how much exposure society would tolerate. Researchers mapped lead from tailpipes into air, dust, and blood, and the numbers stayed too high to ignore. Public pressure rose with them. Governments started setting limits, first as small restrictions, then as clear targets to cut lead down year after year. Industry had long treated lead as a technical requirement, the only practical way to prevent knock in millions of engines. That claim weakened fast. Refineries learned how to produce higher octane fuel without lead, and unleaded stopped sounding like a niche product. At the same time, a new piece of hardware changed the stakes: the catalytic converter. It reduced other toxic exhaust gases, but lead ruined it. Once catalytic converters became a realistic mass-market tool, regulators had leverage they never had before. Cleaner cars now depended on getting the lead out. Rules tightened. Fuel standards shifted. Car makers and oil companies adapted because the market demanded compliant vehicles, not because they suddenly agreed on the health risk. Leaded gasoline lost its last defense. It was no longer a necessary ingredient. It became a problem with an exit plan. The phase-out did not move like a single wave across the world. Some countries cut lead fast once rules and new fuel systems locked in. Others moved slowly, step by step, with deadlines that slipped. Oil companies and additive makers kept pushing back, warning of higher costs, supply problems, and engine damage. In places with weaker enforcement, leaded gasoline stayed on the market longer than many expected. The uneven timeline mattered because pollution followed the fuel. When one region switched, its tailpipe lead fell sharply, but neighboring markets still burned lead every day. Smuggling and old stock sales undercut bans. In some countries, governments hesitated, worried about older vehicles and refinery upgrades, and industry groups used that fear. The result was simple. The last holdouts kept emissions high year after year. Then the change showed up where it counted, in people's blood. As leaded gasoline disappeared, national blood lead averages dropped quickly and by large amounts. That drop did not fix what had already happened, but it made the past impossible to ignore. When exposure fell, researchers saw the contrast more clearly. The earlier levels had not been normal. They had been mass poisoning, spread through everyday driving. By the time leaded gasoline largely disappeared, the air changed faster than the ground did. Lead that once left tailpipes settled into soil along roads, in playgrounds, and in the dust that drifted indoors. It stayed there for decades. In many older homes, it mixed with other old sources of lead and built up quietly. The result felt confusing. The main cause got removed, yet exposure never fully ended. Health systems and researchers kept finding the same pattern. Even low levels of lead in the body still linked to harm, especially in children, where brains and behavior got shaped early and permanently. Communities near heavy traffic of the past carried higher risk long after the traffic moved on. Families could do everything right and still get hit by contaminated dust. Lead no longer travelled as a cloud. It lingered as a residue. That left a harder question than any engine problem. What did a century of exposure cost society? Studies argued over how much lead reduced learning, earnings, and health across whole populations, and how much it fed long-term inequality. Numbers varied, but the direction stayed the same. The quick fix for knock ended up as a slow, wide poison. It solved a mechanical flaw and created a public health one.